Hi everyone, and welcome again to my audiovisual channel. I am Gabriela Handal. I'm a draftsman and also the host of the show, A Conversation About Art. During each episode, I look for the meaning of art and beauty through conversations with colleagues in different artistic fields. Today, I offer you episode 63, and I will have this conversation with artist Maya Koenig. Not entirely sure how to pronounce that, but she will tell us in a little bit. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by liking and sharing this video and also by subscribing to my audio-visual channel. These are all immediate and at no additional cost to you. If you'd like to show your support with money, it's also very welcome and appreciated. You can do so by purchasing my drawings directly from my website, which is just gabrielahandal.com, one word. You can purchase crafts I make from eBay, buy prints of my drawings, or leaving me a tip. Thank you for your time and attention in watching this episode, and do leave a comment so I know you watched this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Okay. Well, Maya Koenig, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me today. You are episode 63. Welcome to A Conversation About Art. Please tell our listeners and viewers who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm Maya, and Gabriela and I went to the New York Academy almost 10 years ago in August.
Oh, wow, yeah. Okay.
And so I've been in New York for 10 years, and since I've left grad school, I've been exploring a ton of different art mediums. So doing things in film and in fashion and theater, and I happen to be in audio right now. So I work in audio and podcasting, audiobooks and podcasting as an operations person.
Yes. Okay. Do you still take photographs and paint?
Yeah, I do. I still do a bit of photography, and it's sometimes analog and it's sometimes digital, with my phone. And then I yeah, I do that. I would say drawing wise, less so much. I mean, it's more sketching. And I had a studio briefly during COVID, and it was like, with acrylic. It was kind of like the old work that got on paper, acrylic and paper, and mainly dry and wet media that is not oil, anything that isn't oil based. And but I haven't had a consistent studio, I would say, since grad school. And so it's been a bit of like an identity crisis, but then it's also been sort of like a way to think about, and it's very similar to when I was in school where I wasn't very consistent. Like the subject matter was never consistent, the style was never consistent, the medium was never consistent. It's very much like how I am post grad in terms of like my exploration, like the creative side of what I think about and do actively.
Okay. Sounds like me. Although, I mean, I do stick with drawing just because I like drawing a lot.
Yeah, I'm really good at drawing too.
But thanks. But the subject matter, I mean, one could argue that the subject matter is consistent in that it's always the figure, but it's kind of just, I don't know, like the stylistic depiction, I guess, is not consistent.
Yeah.
And I would like it if you talked a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is for yourself to where now you're reaching into even other avenues of artistic expression like filmmaking, and you said fashion also, and right?
Yeah. Um, why I explore through different media
Yeah,
or the subject matter. I mean,
both.
it's yeah, because I think, I think if I was still in grad school, I would have to explain that in some way. And I think that the best way for me to explain it is that I don't know, I think sometimes it comes, maybe the source of that whole, like how it plays out has something to do with just being bilingual, being interested in how people communicate, being interested in like cross cultural communication. I know that the theater production that I worked on was about like bilingual,
What
relationships, like
other language do you speak?
Hebrew,
Okay.
and which is also like culturally very different. Like being Israeli is very different. Speaking Hebrew is left to right and right to left. Like there's also a bit of different orientation also for that reason. But just being bilingual and like the theme of that play, for example, was about like cultural miscommunication in like a millennial's life, in dating and like being a transplant. And which is like kind of very similar to some of the stuff that I find interesting now with some of like the work that we do. And the one that is most, the one that I have most maybe creative involvement on was like about like bilingual concepts, cultural concepts and things that I know that when I was teaching color theory for a period of time at CUNY, like that was the most fascinating part of what we were talking about, which was like how do you describe, how do you identify color without a word for the color, and like the perception of ideas, the relativity of colors, that whole thing. And I think that is like it's like touching on that theme continuously. So in terms of the medium shifts, and I think the medium shifts in a way, my interest in it shifts too, because the thing itself, this concept of like cross cultural, like living in the gray or like standing in the door between two ideas or two realities, like that's also very shifting. Like that's a concept that exists in like so many um in other languages, in other cultures, like in, now other people are starting to think about this in identities and like gender. It's like these are shape shift it's a shape shifting concept, but the concept is relatively the same. It's like how do you live in the gray between two notions or like two thought processes. So I think I've explored that a lot. I feel like I come back to that concept a lot. I feel like I start collaborating with other people about that a lot. And it's because I think as a concept it shifts its shape in many ways. I was talking about it recently actually yesterday, and I'm trying to think of who, but I think it was one of the actors who I know here, and he was just talking about like seeing a play in Yiddish, and it was about like being a refugee, but like how a refugee is actually like living in someone else's indigenous place. And I was like, that's wonderful. Like a concept, like those would be my kind of stories, like stories about like being able to see, um, you know, in the gray between the black and white of something that
Mm-hmm.
isn't so black and white or so
Mm-hmm.
good or bad. Um, so yeah, I think that's where I've ended up. It's been that theme in various, outputs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing about exploring how things are said differently, or what kind of, or the different kinds of, just the different kinds of ways of saying something, or the different kinds of ways that saying something feels in the different ways. Um, so could that be, could an example of that be, I mean, just like trying to depict something in a painting versus in a photograph
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
in a
I would say
play?
so. Yeah, I would say so. Like I think it's a bit like trying to problem solve different ways
Mm-hmm.
um to get at it. So yeah, I mean, how do you represent the subtleties of not being able to decide between two worlds or two identities, or which one's more right in terms of a perspective or a perception of a reality or a concept of a reality. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, how do you actually say that or get to that? I think there's no easy way to say it, but there's many interesting ways to try and say it, and it's not always direct. It's not always like, oh, I'm making a photograph about, I'm trying to find in photography, like a way to talk about bilingualism. Like it's not like that. I think what you end up seeing is like there's a series of photos that I'll do, and they'll be about shadows and light. And I think that like, and they're just like obsessive like ways of finding the play between like a frame and the light that casts a shadow from that frame. So it could be like a window, or it could be like fire escape, like the patterns of the fire escape. And I think that that is a way of exploring it, that like to some degree if you can think about polar opposite ideas and try to understand where is the middle ground, like unless you can think about other places where you see that polar opposite, where you see black on white, literally, by looking at shadows and light, and then think about, and first of all, it's just fascinating. It's beautiful. And it like, it led me to looking at like Russian constructivism and photography there. And that's like very similar structure and like, black on white, shadows and light sort of like compositions. And it also like references a lot of graphic design, but that's like another, like everything leads onto a, like, everything starts trailing on, layering on these ideas of like black on white. You explore it through photography, but it makes you think about, well, then why do the polar opposites, why do they exist? What is what's the satisfaction of having those concrete extremes, this like very easy to understand, and why is it harder to maybe conceive the gray, the middle ground of an idea? And then, so you would tag it from different angles, and it's very like, I find that after I look at things like that, if I start a series like that, or after I go from that to a play, I do see that there's a relationship. I see that I'm thinking about the same things, but I don't know how to understand what I'm thinking about. So I don't look at it head on. I look at like something over here that's attractive about what I'm seeing in the world, or something over here that sounds like an interesting story. But when I step back, like I realize that I'm thinking about the same thing again and again. And I think another thing I'm interested in is how people think, right? Like as a teacher, it's like always been, and as like an ops person right now, like it's another theme to my work is just like thinking how people think and being interested. Also, when I was at the academy, like post grad, like helping other students think through their process. And so like with those two, exploring it through different avenues, trying to answer that problem from different places, by not necessarily looking at the question, but like looking at different ways. It's like a bit like cooking. Like you make a meal, but you don't make one meal. When you serve someone, you make like you make like one complimentary appetizer that goes with one complimentary first dish that goes with one complimentary, and they all supposed to complement each other to give one experience, but they're not actually one experience, or they're not one dish. They're like many, many dishes to try and get to the kind of the vibe of the evening for when you're hosting. So yeah, I do think they come from different. That is the only way to think about that problem, I think, or think about those sorts of. For me, I think for other people, they go on the same train of thought, or they are able to make versions of the same style of a painting or a concept. They're able to perceive it before they make it. They're able to plan it. That's not so much true for me.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk more about the bilingual stuff and try to understand more about your perception of being bilingual and having, because were you born in Israel or what?
No, I was born in Chicago. It's a very big like immigrant population of lots of people who are.
Okay, so then what is your connection to Hebrew and Israel?
Oh, my parents are Israeli, my sister. So my family immigrated like just before I was born. So,
okay, so then right, so then all right, so then you're pretty permeated with that, because the people that surrounded you while growing up were like just fresh from over there.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Like
okay.
Yeah, like a first language. Like if I was in public school, I would have been, I guess, a second language learner. Yeah.
Okay. I have lots of thoughts and feelings about that, because I born and raised in Panama.
Right.
And so I also grew up there, and I got here when I was like already 30, I think.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, I never necessarily felt like super Panamanian or something. I'm familiar with the culture or everything, but having, I guess the way that I kind of feel about it is that the being born, it's like, all right, give me a second. I perceive other people to be proud of certain things over which they had no choice.
Mm.
um, like where they were born and the culture from which they were born,
Yeah.
into which they were born, rather. Um, and even though I think it's cool to obviously be familiar with it and know about it and like things about it, I don't understand the sense of pride towards that.
Okay.
Um, and I mean, just because it doesn't make any sense to me, because it's like, I mean, I didn't apply for it or anything. I was just born.
Yeah,
You see what I'm saying? I mean, does that
I
make
do.
sense?
Of course.
Um,
Yeah.
and so like, it's really quite common here in the United States that if that I'll hear people, and it's not a new thing. It's constant. It's always been there that people are like, yeah, I've never really fit in because my dad is from here and my mom is from there, or because my parents are from here and like they're immigrants, and then the culture quote in the United States is so different from us and stuff, or something, and it's like, that is, and at the same time, it's like that is how entire cultures and groups of people are formed, right? So like you
Yeah.
start with something and then everybody changes each other with
Yeah.
interactions,
There
and
is
then
groupthink, yeah, involved.
no, it's not what.
Groupthink to some
It's no,
degree
it's
too.
not groupthink. Groupthink is like hive mind where everybody just like chants the same thing. It's like that's not what I mean. I mean like the interactions between everyone and everything. It's like, an individual starts as something, and then via
Mm-hmm.
the interactions with family, and then with friends, and then with loved ones, and then with enemies, and then with whatever it is, it's like all of that stuff changes the individual, and it also changes the people with whom you're interacting. So
Okay.
it's like, I guess like those divisions between, and divisions that, by the way, seem really arbitrary to me.
Mm.
um I really don't quite understand it. And also, like, then coming in, talking about the language stuff, I
Mm-hmm.
also grew up speaking Spanish and English.
Mm-hmm.
um and for me, the issue with having the two languages, both of them, like fluidly available, it's like I'm pretty fluid in both, English and Spanish. um it's always been more about accuracy, in the sense of like how something feels when I say it, based on, I guess, the experience I had, or like based on the experience that I've had with the terms and the definition that I know of the term.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like it isn't strictly about like English being black and white and Spanish being white. I mean, because I'm trying to think about what you were saying about how these polar opposites.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Although, I mean, languages are obviously not opposites because
Yeah, and
there's
that's
so very many of them. But anyway, I'm like
yeah.
rambling a little bit. But just like tell me what you think about the ramble.
Yeah, I mean, I think first, I think the identity part of it is like a bit I it's a bit like being an artist, right? I mean, there's a lot of people like one way of thinking about being bilingual slash like bicultural is this idea of like people are very tied to the identity because to some degree they feel different. I think that's similar to what it's like growing up as an artist. I mean, I think those are the two strongest identities I have, right? Being an artist, whatever that means, and being of a different culture constantly, like no matter where even if I go there, right? And that's talked about a lot in a lot of people's experiences. Like no matter where they go, there are too much of one thing in each place. So I do think like a better way to think about maybe the idea of bilingualism or like biculturalism is to think about the third identity that we may have, as an artist, like, or a second identity as that, and to be able to make sense of maybe, how sometimes we didn't choose. I don't think I personally didn't choose being an artist to have this
Right.
way of thinking or the sensitivity or, sometimes that burden of like being able to see the world too much in a certain way and like not knowing how to express it any other way but using your hands. So I think there's that similarity. Like there isn't a choice, and for better or worse, we kind of occupy that space and decide like we're going to make the most of it, or that we're going to indulge in it, or that we're going to try to meet. I know I went to grad school because I really wanted to know other people like me, and I think I genuinely wanted that validation. Like I wanted validation of other people seeing me as an artist, like in the group sense, in the group way that we've established what artist means, at least in the context of a schooling and a learning environment. And I think it's similar. I think it's similar to, and I think I remember talking to someone about, identity, especially if you have, let's say, if you're a minority. And I remember him saying it was like an Italian friend who lives in Sweden or Copenhagen. And he was like, no one really, like, it doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter. And I was like, no, it really does matter, because one interesting thing that I think about when I think about identity is, like, especially if you're a minority, is the way that things, the context where you come from is how, and the same thing with artwork, the context where you come from, like your perception changes everything, right? It changes like how you're able. So I mean, this to me, this comes back down to color theory. Like if you don't have a word for a certain color, it doesn't exist to some degree. Your language, or if your perception, if your ability to express this thing, whatever, and color happens like this, but also certain concepts like feelings, if there isn't a word for it in the language that you're trying to communicate in, it doesn't exist to some degree to the people around you who you're trying to communicate to, until there's a word for it. And like until there was a word for blue, people didn't see blue, supposedly, like in the Iliad, like Odyssey times. And so they saw like gray, and they saw white for the ocean and for the sky. And so there's this idea that, like, I think when someone doesn't move about the world with the knowledge or the awareness, or sometimes maybe the identity, like the strong sense of identity around like what they are because of where they came from, it's really not helping to provide the context as to why they now see the world a certain way. I think as soon as you're able to then, if you're someone who's not from that culture or from that language, you're able to at least know what you don't realize, that you don't know something. There's not a word for something that they're trying to express. Like that's the most rudimentary of expressing that problem. Like there isn't a word for what you're trying to express, and you're trying to express it with a slew of other words. But there is some like a better understanding, even as someone who doesn't speak Spanish. Like there is a better understanding, even from the realization that I can't possibly know maybe a nuance of what you're trying to say. And I think that there is more there is more understanding in that as a result. Like there is more respect there in being able to communicate with people who identify, or can be able to strongly identify at least how they think now, because of, as a result of where they came from, as a result of the words of the language they didn't have. I think one good example, because it sounds a bit abstract, but one good example is to say, I used to teach like communications design, and a lot of my students were immigrants and second language learners. And I had to do a research paper. They had to do a research paper. I had to teach them how to do a research paper at the end of the semester. And what I realized that I actually had to teach them how to write a research paper, because what I realized is that they were writing papers not in an American English way of writing. The American English way of writing any kind of thing, but especially an argument, is very linear. It's A plus B equals C. So that's the way that people problem solve in this country when it's something very basic like an email or a research paper or even a story. And there's like a really interesting, Robert Kaplan is the writer who writes about this for English language learners. Like he literally visualizes it, and he says English is A plus B equals C. It's a line. If you go to like a romantic language, go to a Semitic language, if you go to an Oriental language, that's how he identifies it, and then Russian, it's actually, to make an argument doesn't work in an A plus B manner. It has to be like, at least for a Semitic, the one I could identify most, you have to basically go off track to get on track. Like there's no such thing as a track to begin with. There's like, you make meanderings to make your point. Your point must, in order to tell your argument, you have to meander off the argument. Relative to an American, like that's what it looks like. It looks like meandering. Relative to like someone who speaks Arabic or Hebrew, that's the way to tell a story. That's the place to start from. So what I had to do with these students is I had to say, and this is what the Robert Kaplan argument makes, is like, you're not wrong, and you don't see the world in the wrong way, but you have to realize that when you communicate, if you can't just translate from Spanish to English, because most of my students are Spanish speakers, you can't just translate from Spanish to English. You have to look at English way of thinking, which is A plus B equals C, whereas Spanish, I can't remember what it was, but it was not a straight line. It was like telling a story maybe in a circle. I can't remember. And you can't be direct about your points. You're telling more of like a story that meanders as well. Um, you have to realize, you have to explain to your students, you're not thinking differently. Your world, your perception of the world is not wrong, and it's simply that you can't just automatically translate how you tell a story from Spanish to English. You must translate the way you tell an argument to a new way, a new framework, a new reality, and then translate the language onto it. And like I think that's what's, to me, the most interesting thing, because I think that's what gets the most tension and the most confusion. It's not, and it's like, and I think another concept that I think is really interesting is just like the concept of gaslighting. And I think like language and I think culture, like we're all like, if you're coming from a different place, you go to a different place of way of living. It's like everyone's sort of like in this reality that's different from a completely different reality. It's most prominent if you go to like a communist country or a country that used to be communist and then not live there, right? Or not be there. And you talk to people about their experience like pre the Berlin Wall or something coming down. I think these are all ways that I think when I'm thinking about what you're saying, like thinking about identity, thinking about the importance of it is to be able to explain, like, why do I think this way? Because I'm an artist. Why? So therefore, if I'm an artist, why do I see the world this way? Instead of like, it's as a way to understand versus like a way to think of yourself as like, um, because if you're part of a culture that isn't that way, like I don't think this mainstream culture is an art focused, sensitive person way of meandering and living and making money and living in the world. It's not. Like, we are a minority in that sense. I think it's easier to understand once you can identify what the thing is that you are. It's easier to understand how to navigate and how to understand how you're not wrong, for example, because a lot of times it feels like you're wrong by feeling like when you're a minority and you can't make sense of the world, not just because of the language, because of the way you tell your story or the way you make an argument, right? Or the way you're trying to be heard or understood. And there's this concept of like certain things, certain concepts, certain understandings don't exist in other languages or just as concepts in other cultures. And that's really fascinating. And all this like lost in all the moments of being lost in translation there. Um, I might have gone completely off topic. The second thing you said, I can't remember, but I also had something to say in response to that. Might have lost it though. I don't know. We would have to go back.
That thing about different, the thing about making arguments in different languages, that makes little to no sense to me, because it's like you can obviously make an argument both in English and in Spanish and go straight to the point, or you can meander. It's like it's perfectly possible to meander in both languages. Like, I don't understand.
Yeah. I mean,
That
meander
makes no sense to me.
I think, yeah, the simplest way to describe it is simply that for example, when someone tries to take their thought process and just translate it into English, that may not work. It depends on
Okay,
how,
sure.
it depends. Yeah, I have a friend who's French. She's very art oriented. Her mind, I think she thinks, best way to describe it, she thinks more like an artist. She's not analytical. Analytical is like A plus B equals C. And an art mind is like starts in one direction, let's say in one type of practice, right? You start in one direction, then you go off into another idea and you come back maybe to the central idea one day. You come, 6 months later, you're on a different topic, and then you find out later that you're thinking of the same train of thought. Like, it's kind of what I'm describing. Like, um I'm interested in talking about cross-cultural problems, but I'm looking at like shadows and darkness and looking at constructivism, and then I go from that to like a different concept about talking about color theory, and then I come back to it like a year later being like, oh, this is all about the same. That's like an artist way of solving a problem, right? It's not analytical. Analytical is like it's like an engineering way of problem. You see the problem is very easily identifiable, right? And then you go about the steps of placing the right things in the right place to make it so. And so she's French, right? And she explains to me that like the language, the way the language is oriented, it's very easy to think about how she struggles in America constantly, because the way that the language is set up and the way that the culture is set up, it's a very um, mainstream. More so, it's like it's an analytical way of problem solving, or analytical way of doing business, or economics, or even in a startup that I'm in, like, even though it's not corporate America, it's a very similar setup. So she, in that way, she really struggles. Whereas her boyfriend, who is works in banking, and he works with numbers and he works with money, he really struggles to explain what he does in French and to problem solve what he does in French. But he has a very easy job in English. So when when he's in France and he has to talk about his work or problem solve his job, he does it in English, even though he's in France. And I think there's an interesting, and like that was unrelated, like we found that out through talking, but not talking about this. And it was like an interesting way to sort of illustrate how sometimes, like for example, if you're an artist and if you struggled a lot of times in a mainstream American school, sometimes it's because mainstream American school is really, science and math oriented, and it's little less, becoming less and less oriented towards like a Dewey way of thinking of the classroom, which is like putting the art room in the middle and having all the subjects permeate off of the art room. That would be educating and thinking in terms of an art inquiry based idea, but that's not very mainstream. Mainstream would be more science. It's being able to like get through the tiers of learning and thinking, which is science and math, writing, English, grammar, and then the arts are the periphery. So if you're an artist and you struggle with making what you do part of like mainstream America without it becoming like a hugely analytical enterprise, it's because I think we're not oriented, this language, this culture is not oriented in that way. It's not inquiry based. It's like money based. It has to be able to have a bottom line. It has to be able to make a business out of it. So I think that's maybe one way to think about it, is thinking about it, how difficult it may be to be an artist and yet be in like a mainstream, not academic, maybe not academia based work situation, like work life situation, which is what I've struggled with. Like I think I struggled with trying to make my everyday be more crafted and be more inquiry oriented and be less about like a product or a bottom line or deadlines are great. That's not what I'm talking about. It's more of like, how can an art mind enter a workforce and have the workforce not be the thing that takes over, and that culture happens to be a lot more analytical and a lot more straight linear based thinking.
I feel like one of the great downfalls, or one of the great flaws of being obsessed with identity the way that I think it's pretty common to be now, is that if you think, if a person thinks they're something, they think they can't be something else, or that they're inept at the other things that don't fit, quote unquote, within the identity that they think they are.
Yeah.
And I think that is obviously it's like a huge flaw, because it's like it's not so okay. So that's one big flaw. The other big flaw is that it's obviously a gross oversimplification of a human.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think it's a mistake to laser focus. It's a mistake to fixate on, for example, like in my case, if I was to fixate that, oh, I'm an artist, I can't have a bank job. It's like, oh, I'm an artist, I can't make any money. It's like, oh, I'm an artist, I can't do addition or subtraction. It's like, that is absurd and extremely condescending of the abilities that everyone is capable of.
Yeah. And I
think that's pretty flawed. And I really find it very frustrating how prevalent the obsession with that stuff is. It's like I remember I don't know, a few years ago maybe, that I saw, like, not memes exactly, but just images to post on Facebook about how labels are for clothes. And it's like, now they're back, like, after having taken really fucked up steroids, and it's really fucking annoying. It's like, I find it really quite irritating, because it's like it's like, why do people want to be boxed into things? It's like, I thought we were aware that is not what makes a person. A person is so complex, so layered. It's like you're not just made of out of where you were born. You're made out of everything that you ever come into contact with, everything you eat, everything you read, everything you look at, everywhere you stand, everywhere you do, everything you do with your body, everything you wear. It's like it's so complicated.
Yeah. I think this concept of it is a spectrum. And I think the spectrum that I'm more interested in when you talk about identity, I think I'm most interested in understanding identity in order to understand your perception. And that's where
Ooh, no.
which is an endless, which is doing this, right? It's an outwardly, it's a curiosity identity aspect of identity, meaning like, why do I think the way I think? Why do I believe the way I believe? In order to break it down, essentially, like in order to be able to say, like, this isn't real, like this isn't a real concept. It's where, but it also explains a lot of like how I see things and why other people don't get how I see things. So
I mean, they
it's
probably don't get the way you see things because they're different people. Like it's another person. It's like
and that's why it's
the only one that can
genuinely
get
interesting.
whatever it is. It would have because it's they don't see it because what you're seeing is within Maya only. It's like that's why
Well, yeah,
it's
exactly.
physically impossible for them to see the same thing.
But yeah, it's a bit of like a meta exploration because I think why do we make art otherwise, right? For me, it's like I make art to some degree because I'm trying to problem solve and communicate. So I think like I problem solve, like I want to understand why I think the way I think. That's one. And two is because I want other people to feel it with me. Like I think in other forms I have a hard time communicating. Whereas with an art form, it's potentially maybe my only real outlet. So but why do we do it then? And so then there is this element of like, if I can understand how I perceive, and then I can explain, therefore, the way I think, can someone else finally understand,
Mm-hmm.
and make a
Mm-hmm.
connection? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's like why it's important. I don't think of the other end of identity and the way you think about it. I think that's like I think you're right. I think the reason why people want to be boxed in is because it's too hard. It's too hard to think about all the possibilities that it's of everything else. Like the gray is so much harder to perceive than the blacks and whites of labels. And I think about diagnoses, I think about healthcare, and I think about, when you talk about this, like I think about how sometimes it's really helpful to know, to feel something and be denied, have a doctor deny that you're feeling anything, and then to finally have a name for it, like a label for it, like a diagnosis, like how relieving that is, because then you're like, it's A, because you can problem solve, and B, because you can communicate. Like you can find other people who you can talk to be like, yes, this, like, to validate the experience. And so I think it's like similar. I think art is like another tool. I think there's an extreme which you've just identified. That's like the extreme of ignorance on the other side of the spectrum of what identity becomes, how it gets commodified, how it gets the way that, people start identifying in this way in order to sell something. Like that's the extreme. But I think
Or
the
to
more
get pity,
interesting, hmm?
or to get pity
Yeah, or to get,
and attention.
yeah, essentially, but like my end of thinking about it would be like, why am I trying to get pity? Why am I trying to get attention? Like that's where like I would just keep going down the spiral because to me that's to like finding authenticity and like honesty. And I think it's the same thing with artwork. And I like used to talk about this, like how do I judge good artwork? And I was like, does it look like the artist is being authentic slash honest about like their inquiry?
Mm.
So it's like
Okay.
it's not like, oh, I want to make a product, like I want to make paintings about X. Like
Mm.
to me like that's like I want to vomit when I think of that, like artwork that does that. And I know that people have to do that for the gallery because they have to simplify it into a box and they have to be like, this is what this person makes. It's easier for you to consume it if you know what they make as a label. But like I can't do that. And it's like very evident of that based on the fact that I'm always doing a different medium to describe a similar thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's just therefore the reason why I can't commodify it in that way. But I think the interest and the importance of that interest and that inquiry and like the way that people want to take want to plunge into, I think it's a very important idea of like going into identity, going into communication, going into being understood, these sorts of things as a way to as a more like to me like more honorable exploration for art making rather than the commodification and like the simplification of it. To me, that's like I see it the way when you get frustrated about that when you see it online. Like I get frustrated about that when I see it in like an artist statement in a gallery. Like, you know,
What a
it's just
cop
like,
out. Yeah.
ugh, yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Miss Koenig, what is art in your opinion?
I guess based on what I just blabbed on about, I think it's
Did you say blabbed on about?
blabbered. I can't communicate. I told you. This is why I have to draw and not speak. I think based on what I said, it's a I think it's a form of communication if you're lucky and you're able to maybe uh make something understood in a way without using words. And I think it's a form of yeah, self exploration, like getting to a more authentic state of yourself. I think that's what art is to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then maybe with each work or artistic activity that a person does, they are just doing a search within themselves, and then
Yeah.
the part about other people looking at the result of that search, they're maybe trying to communicate the result of the search to other people.
I think there's a first element is I really like believe that the subconscious comes out through your art, and I really believe that it's there, like there's therapeutic qualities to it that you when you try to understand or try to kind of like come to an authentic place in yourself, if you try to do it directly, if you try to look at it directly, it's not going to work. You have to kind of look at it through, you know, through non-language forms. Like you have to like be able to, it's like when you try to problem solve, you can't really solve it half the time. You have to do the dishes, go on autopilot, do something else while you're trying to solve that problem. Art for me is like that. It's like trying to get to a truth indirectly, and by doing it indirectly, your subconscious activates through the work. And the most meaningful and the reason and the compulsion to have to make something that is an art that is archiving that experience, or something that, like, you know, manifests it in a physical form. The compulsion to do that, I think, is because you want to communicate. I mean, I think because you have to, like, physically, it's where it wants to be. It wants to be in this like physical form. But I also think like one of the most satisfaction, you know, one of the fondest memories I have is like before I would think I was going to stop making art altogether for some reason, was when I had two pieces of work. One was more photorealistic, one was more abstract. They were both figurative. And the teacher said, put the abstract one. And I was in a gallery in Italy, and like some guys who didn't speak any Italian or any English, but only in Italian, came up to me with the broken English and being like, "This means so much to me." But like they don't, you know, they were like these a different generation, like a different culture,
Like
different
older than
language,
you or something?
much older than me, and
Okay.
like these were pictures of my friends. Like these are pictures like of a bunch of girls. It was it was abstracted, but like it was clear that like these are nothing was related to anything whatsoever, but like the fact that they found so much meaning in it. Like I remember being like, I could never stop doing this if this is truly like if I have so much satisfaction in that experience, like realizing that like there is there is something to connect there with someone, and the satisfaction of having it be like someone who has no relationship to me. Like it's not some friend or family who want to support my work. Like it's like genuine public, you know, perception of it. One of the reasons why I wanted to do film, because I remember thinking like, wow, film is like people have less access to art. They understand visual art a lot less. Like it's just not as democratic, like it's not as universal. Um, Whereas like film is something that everyone can consume. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to be in film. So that's like how I did some film for a little bit. And I believe that. I still believe that. Like I do think that film is a wonderful medium because anyone and everyone can really like they feel like they entitled to like perceive it and like have opinions about it. And I think that's great. I don't feel film is really hard as an artist, as a maker, if you want something more immediate.
Okay. So this thing about art being communication and an artist searching for something within themselves and then making a thing as a result of that, and then them trying to show that to other people and communicating that which was within them to others. That makes me think of the issue of visual language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if you think different cultures are different, I think that visual language is way more fucking different. It's like it's way more fucking difficult to communicate that
What are we
in that
describing?
language.
Wait, so what
Because
are we
I'm talking about visual
describing?
language, like just images. It's like if you
Okay.
just have images, I mean, if you make a film, if you make a painting, a drawing, a photograph, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and you're and it's like, say for example, you took a picture and you're like, oh my god, in this picture I want to talk about I don't know, love, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
anything. It is so unlikely that somebody else is gonna see the same thing that you
And perceive
intended.
love. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
everyone's visual language, or and I mean, I think that has resulted just because of the homogeneity of visual language is not the same as it was like during Renaissance Europe. It's like not only do many more people, basically the whole world, can now gaze upon your work,
Mm-hmm.
but they all, it's like, there isn't like the same standardization of ideas that there was before. It's like
Exactly.
before it was so standardized that people could teach illiterate people about the Bible via paintings. You
Right.
cannot do that anymore.
That was also the
You
reason
know,
why it exists. That was the vehicle.
right?
Like art was a teaching, it was a literacy vehicle. Whereas now anything a pencil on a floor is art. So we have definitely expanded the scope of what art is meant to do as what it's meant to serve. Yeah. Plus everyone has access to making art, which is what is brilliant too. Like as a teacher, I was like, wow, these students like have not learned principles of design, but they're really good at composing because everyone has access to like some really interesting tools. So yeah, you're right. Like the scope of the purpose for art has really broadened to fulfilling many different roles slash having no purpose at all, like no essential purpose for communication. And second, it's like the tools people that have been given to make art are really advanced, so everyone has access to it. But I don't think so. I mean, yeah, what do you do when that like I think the communication part is just a byproduct. I don't think the purpose of art for me is to communicate, but I think it's a byproduct that I find very satisfactory. I find it very meaningful, but I also find it also one of the reasons why I didn't want to make art, because I felt that it was too much potential for essentially not seeing your audience and not communicating. Like it's like not like you're standing by your artwork when you share it.
Right.
I happened to be there at the time, but like I wasn't like the thing that's so frustrated to me about art, visual art, is like you're not sitting in the museum next to your work getting all the satisfaction of the love and the occasional person who's like I love it. It's a byproduct. Like you have to not make it for that reason. But I do think that is a reason why I make it.
Mm.
you know.
Yeah. Okay. And at the same time, and now that we're talking further about it to argue against my own point, um, we're obviously not that different because the hardware is the same, including the brain, the body, like all of the systems within the body. We all have to eat, we all have to go to the bathroom to poop and stuff. So it's like that. So if there is that commonality between every single human body in the world, then that means that there's also obviously other commonalities like mental, psychological. And so like I also think that or at least it makes a lot of sense to me that there are also at least something, at least one thing that everyone would be able to understand visually.
And it's not really, and I think it's not really meant for everyone to understand. Like, I think back to the beginning of this conversation, like when we talk about culture, and like there is some element of, I think groupthink may be the word. I don't know if it's the right word. It's like this identifying in the minority of, in the new nuance of an experience. So I think the reason why I feel so fond of being able to speak the language and going back to a certain place in time and like a certain setting is because there is not a nostalgia, but there is like a beauty in like in finding a niche scenario that someone else can understand. So it's not like I want a good example of this is there's Joan Mitchell painting in the Art Institute of Chicago. And because I'm from Chicago, like I was raised in Chicago, and she's a Chicago painter. She's an abstract artist. So she's just like, it's not meant to be representational. But I remember passing it by and then being really alarmed, like, I know that place. Like it's an abstract painting, but I was like, I know that place. And I only know that place because I think I live in the same world of this niche experience of having lived in a certain place next to a lake and next to a certain setting where suddenly her abstract painting of Lake Michigan and I looked and then I read and I was like, it was like Chicago, Lake Michigan, something. It was like something like Lake Forest, like some place that I know. And I was like, that is so beautiful. Like it's not meant for everyone to necessarily say and be like, that's a painting of Lake Michigan. But there is something really wonderful when a subset of people can know what it is and then not get it right, but then relate to her rendering or her version of that experience. And then other people take it for some other completely different reason. But there is some beauty in that. Like there is some beauty in being like a likened experience, which is why I think language is really special, which is why I think culture and identity is really special. In the world, it kind of wants to globalize every experience and make everyone the same, make it all same. Like I think it's really special when you can say, no, this is a very specific experience. This is a very specific moment in time, a very specific emotion. Some of my favorite movies are about that. Like it's about like the very specific moment of falling in love and not being able to articulate anything and being too X, Y, and Z to be, and like usually, and those movies are beautiful because it can be so good at telling a specific moment. And that's why that's when good art comes to be. It's not trying to tell something universal that everyone can understand. It's trying to tell something very, very personal that if other people are willing to rise to the occasion of that experience at that moment, can relate to it too, can remember that experience too. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Actually, that just reminded me of I don't remember the episode number, but the artist was called Milan Franklin. It was like 2-3 episodes ago. And we talked about that very thing about talking to a specific group of people in a way, because they share that one specific thing. Yeah. Whether it's women being pregnant, and it's like only another woman that has specifically been pregnant will be able to understand the way that you felt, for example. Mm-hmm. Or the Milan Franklin is a double amputee, and it's like only another double amputee will probably be able to really understand whatever, like, oh my god, I hate, I don't know, whatever it is that he might be feeling. Only another person that has experienced the same thing will be able to understand. At the same time, the experiences of each individual are not exactly the same, first of all. Second of all, one of the things I think is very interesting and remarkable and important of being a human is to be able to try to understand and imagine what it's like for the other person, and for the person that is trying to explain their experience to somebody that has physically no way of experiencing it, for them to try to verbalize it or illustrate it through work. Like I think those are really valuable and just interesting exercises to do for just all parties involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot like the conversation about language, right? If you don't have a word for it, or if you don't have experience with it, it doesn't exist until someone else is able to explain it or articulate it. So, and that can be an art form. Like you can tell me a word in Spanish that doesn't exist in English, and you can try to get at it from different ways using language. You may want to get at it using a different way, telling a story, or telling an abstract, explaining it visually in some other way, or with music in some other way. And then I might get it better. Like I think that's what's interesting about like the form of art that is meant to be specific, because it may not only like relate to people who are amputees, it may also be able to bring to the surface what I didn't have words for before, or like in this example, like awareness, like physiological awareness of that experience, like that. It won't be something that I've come from. It will be something that you've risen to the surface for me, that I now can feel like I understand. And think that's the yeah, that's the byproduct of communication through art that I think is not necessarily required or like it's not always guaranteed, but I think it's the most satisfying
Mm.
outcome
Okay.
for sure.
Okay. Miss Koenig, then what is beauty in your opinion?
I think um it's being able to be that specific. Like beauty in like in the example of being able to describe being able to as the viewer of that piece being able to empathize with a very specific experience in a very potent way. Like that to me is a beautiful piece. Um, if I think back to like the Joan Mitchell painting, I thought that painting was beautiful. Maybe not necessarily because the painting itself was beautiful, but because the feeling of relating to it was very real, and it validated for me like a sensory like she's this like the sensory experience that she was articulating through the painting of like standing in front of Lake Michigan. I think when I think about like, oh, beautiful moments, like I think of that a lot. Like I think of like, wow, the ability for a director to be able to articulate like a toxic relationship through this 2.5 hour P.T. Anderson movie about like Phantom Thread to me was like a beautiful movie. Even though when I watched it, I was confused the whole time. Like afterwards, I was like, oh, it was about this. Oh my God, that was so beautiful. That was beautiful. Like that's amazing. Like being able to tell a very specific, being able to render a very specific, hard thing to pinpoint emotion or feeling or expression in a physical form that someone else can consume and empathize with and relate to. I think that's one form of beauty. I think that's the one that I like when I talk about beautiful things. That's like when I use it most frequently. Another form of beauty, I guess, would be because all that can come down to maybe something that's trying to be expressed, but sometimes it can come down to just like happenstance, like the way the light is hitting in this moment is beautiful. Or I saw a video the other day of a hummingbird that was snoring, and I was like, this is so fucking beautiful. So gorgeous because he was making like the little whistle sounds, but he was snoring. And so I don't think hummingbirds actually, I don't know if I've ever heard them chirp, but this thing was chirping in its sleep. Or it was there was another one of an octopus that was changing colors while it was sleeping because it was having a dream, so it was changing it was camouflaging based on what it was doing in its dream. And I think that's another example of like when I said, oh my God, that's so beautiful. Like there's just like another form of beauty is just like the random things that happen that you happen to see and be like, how do you explain that? Like how like I never knew that's a real like that's a phenomenon, like that's something that the world can do. That's something that like space and time can bring together in this moment. And like the fact that I got to see it is really beautiful. So it's like I guess those are the two beautiful things to think about.
Mm-hmm. So the first one is when then the artist or whomever is able to accurately depict something, and then the viewer accurately reads the information, picks up on the information.
Yeah, like the ability for a piece of art to hit on a point that is very, very subtle and abstract and ambiguous. Usually an emotion, but sometimes a sensory experience. So like the ability to articulate the way for a painting to be able to memorialize the sensory experience of standing in front of Lake Michigan, or the way that a very long, all the elements of visual, audio, and time is able to express the breakdown of a dynamic with someone who is not good for you. Like that's pretty fucking gorgeous. It's this idea of like how a form of art can capture a very nuanced feeling or sensation or experience. Um, yeah, like Felix Gonzalez Torres is able to express the grief of his lover, who he wished, everyone who feels grief, like to some degree, we wish that person never dies. Like we wish that person was still around. Essentially, like that is like maybe the core of grief that he's describing, because he makes an work of art that is constantly replenished by the museum. So the weight of his body, his lover's body, is constantly replenished in the form of candies in the corner of a museum. And the fact that they constantly are replenishing it by default, by how the artwork is supposed to go, means that his lover never dies.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's always replenished. Like that, like that's such a beautiful way to get at the idea that he wished that he misses his lover and wished he wasn't gone. That's such a beautiful way to like not resolve that, but like memorialize that feeling of like, I wish he could never leave me, you know. I love
Okay.
that.
But it's, I mean, because okay, so that is, it's rather like a descriptive. It's like an adjective. It's like that is beautiful, but then what does the beautiful mean? It's like, why is it?
Yeah.
What does the adjective beautiful or beauty mean? Just like on its own,
In this definition,
in your opinion?
um,
Because
I
so
mean,
like,
yeah.
go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, I think it means awe.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's the definition based on how I'm trying to capture it. Like I think beauty is like this sense of awe, which isn't religious, but I think people describe awe in religious ways, usually.
Mhm.
Like the day of awe. Like
And what is this awe you speak of?
I think it's like the when something seems so big and complex that if you were to try and construct it, it would take years of your energy, and you just see it in a moment in something or somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is considered awe. And like it's beautiful. It's awe. It's like it's not it's like when someone says, "Oh, you look at the galaxy and you consider the idea of infinity."
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing you can think about is awe, because there's no, and maybe that's like the constructivist in me, or like the person who's been overrun by analytical thinking for the last 4 years. But like, I just think about, how would I do that? How would I build that? How would I make that? Like, how would I possibly try to construct that experience, or that? How do I start trying to think about the infinity? Like, I just want to, like, to me, it's like I've thought about the nuance of that experience, or the nuance of that fact, and I can't. So I think that's beautiful. Like, that's awe. Like there's something. So I think that's how I think about beauty in these other ways. Like I think about them, like the fact that this artifact is able to put so much in one moment, or so much in one color. It's able to say so much without words, usually. Without
Mm-hmm.
words, without literally being like, this is about this, without having an artist statement. Like something is able to say something without a statement. That's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. All right. So I like that as kind of the last thing to say on the subject. Um, Maya, why don't you tell our listeners and viewers where your work can be found? What are you up to lately? Is there anything you want to add? What projects do you have coming up? Or is there anything that you're working on that you're excited about?
Oof. Um, I
Not
don't
all
think
those things, like, whatever,
I.
whatever.
I mean, yeah, I think my work is on Instagram. It's the most up to date in terms of where I put things. And what am I working on? I'm not working in the traditional sort of artwork making and exhibiting nature of showing. Right now, like I'm most interested in like user experience, like everything we just talked about is like being thought about in the context of like user experience and how people, like UI UX design and things like that, like communicating and getting things done with a visual and like how people think perspective. So anyway, yeah, in terms of like where to see my work or what I'm up to next, I think yeah, I have a Instagram, I have a website that's being updated. And I'm learning about new things still. But yeah, I'll probably be working in another medium the next time we see each other and doing another, but probably still thinking about the exact same concepts. And so, um, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what we're talking about next.
Indeed. Okay. All right. So, thank you everyone for watching and listening. Special thanks to my guest, Maya, for agreeing to talk to me today and for your time. If you'd like to support Maya, my podcast, myself, or all three, all the corresponding links will be in the caption. Make sure you like this video and leave a comment so we know you saw this episode. And also remember to subscribe to my audiovisual channel. And thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and see you next time. Bye.